So now I want to move on to a question that my teacher did end up asking me about your theory, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
I was sitting in his office and I was telling him about, the project I wanted to do. And I was telling him about how you say we are a consciousness system and we're evolving towards, well, we're pieces of it, but we're all evolving towards lower entropy, towards order, structure, complexity. And he said to me, he says, I always thought life was supposed to be a balance between order and randomness. He says, if Campbell says life is about low entropy or order, doesn't this imply that a very ordered and rigid totalitarian state would be better than a free society?
Mm-hmm. You have to compute entropy based on a system, and you have to compute it for the whole system, and not just for the moment. It's not the entropy at this instant, but it's the entropy of the system, and that includes the system for as long as it goes. So if we look at entropy, like I said, we could just order bits that go up, down, up, down, up, down, and that would be entropy just mechanically because we had some order. We have a series going. But you get a much lower entropy if those up, downs actually mean something, if they have some significance, if they're symbolic for an idea, for a concept, and that concept is meaningful, something that is useful. So if you just order things like you have a totalitarian government where everything is ordered, so the boss guy controls everything, what products get produced, who gets them, how it's distributed, what the prices are. So everything is ordered and he makes all the choices for everyone, okay? That would seem from the outside to be a very orderly society. As Mussolini said, he promised to make the trains run on time. That would be more order. But you're not looking at the whole system. You're looking at just a piece of that system. Okay, that the trains run on time is more orderly, no doubt. But at what price? What do you pay to get those trains to run on time? Why is it that often trains don't run on time? Well, to make those trains and to make your society always function like a machine so that it is regular and orderly requires force. Force generally requires power, threats, demands. A lot of misery goes with that. If that train isn't here on time, you're fired. Or perhaps with Mussolini, you're dead. You see, now you're creating a tremendous amount of entropy. Entropy is going up. You're affecting people's lives. You're forcing things to be exactly the way you want them, according to you. And the way you want them is not necessarily the way they're most efficiently used or connected with other people. So you create a great deal of disorder in people's lives by imposing order on them. So if all you do is look at the outside thing, say, oh, well, look at that. Looks like it's like a well-oiled machine. Trains always run on time. Everything works. Everybody reports to work before 8 o'clock. Nobody ever leaves afterward. Nobody litters, just look at it and say, it looks like a perfect little machine there, but what do you have inhabiting that machine? Robots? If they're people, those people are not happy. Anybody that lives in that kind of an ordered society is devalued. They're just a cog in a wheel. They're not appreciated. They don't have any room for creativity, for doing things in a more efficient way, coming up with better ideas. All of that stuff is squelched. All you do is follow the rules. The rules, mean everything. Carrying individual needs mean nothing. Doesn't work. It's a very high entropy system. Mm-hmm. So that's why it's not just getting all the pieces in a row. That's just a little sliver of it. So what happens is, okay, everything got put in a row, and that will lower entropy one tiny bit. But the entropy that it creates by dysfunctionally forcing everybody to follow those rules, whether they should be followed or not, that creates this much entropy. So that's the problem. By looking at it, you say, well, that looks like it's low entropy. Well, it is, but only a minuscule amount compared to the raise in entropy that it creates by forcing people to act like machines. And when that guy doesn't show up for work on time because, his car broke down or his baby was sick, well, too bad, you're fired. See, that doesn't help people grow up. That makes people angry, upset, and it is not a low entropy solution. So that's the answer to that. Yes, it looks like it, but it's really raising entropy. Totalitarian governments raise entropy. That's why they're unstable. They're fundamentally unstable organizational structures, social structures, because they raise so much entropy that it becomes unstable. There's always somebody else wants to kill that dictator and be the dictator themselves. And then somebody wants to kill that one. And if you look at the life of dictators in the last 200 or 300 years, you'll see they generally don't last long. They very seldom last a lifetime. The last really long-lasting, not individual dictators. Sometimes the dictatorship lasts a longer time. It gets passed from one thug to the next. But even that tends to change and morph. Dictatorship, totalitarianism is an unstable social structure because it raises entropy.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, I tried to give my own answer to that when he asked me, and I don't know if you'll agree, but I used an analogy that comparing the corporate media, so take like a major news network versus the internet. Mm-hmm. And if you look at a major media outlet, they have a handful of free will units at the top making all the decisions. So you got the owner, you might have a handful of executives, and then everyone under there is a cog, basically, and they have to obey the free will of these people at the top. And if you think about how interesting the corporate media is, how useful is it in your life, and how adaptable is it to change, versus something like the internet, where there's no one at the top of the internet, controlling everything. It's more of like a flat structure, not hierarchical. Yet it seems to be more useful, more interesting, and probably more adaptable to change. Meaning it's a lower entropy system than something like, a major network on cable TV or something.
Yeah, that's a good example. I mean, any organization where the people who make up that organization are told to just follow the rules, don't think, don't create, just do what you're told. That is a very suboptimal system. It's ignoring the people. It's treating the people as cogs in a machine. And when you do that, anyone who runs a business will tell you that if you do that to your people, your productivity is going to be very low. Productivity goes up when people are empowered, when they want to go to work, because work is an interesting place where they can be creative, and where they can make suggestions, and where things happen, and where they're an important part of a larger process, not just a replaceable cog. Mm-hmm. So yes, that order, like bureaucracy, you have the idea of a bureaucracy is primarily there to create a ceiling, create a floor. Things won't get any worse than this because we have this bureaucracy, and the bureaucracy has a lot of rules. So bureaucracies tend to be very rule-based. And the general idea is, you don't need brains to be a member of a bureaucracy. All you need are rules. Just do what the rules are. Don't do anything else. If you disobey the rules, you will be punished. Well, if they're good rules, if somebody's really thought about the rules, then that will ensure that the output will never be any worse than a certain level. The rules keep it at that level. But it also says that the output will never be any better than a certain ceiling. So it creates this area in which the system can function. You see, that's the whole point of a bureaucracy. So we have a government bureaucracy, and it's made such that the government will function at a, has a floor. It will, you go down to the Department of Motor Vehicles, and you always have to stand in lines, and the people are often surly, and all the rest of that goes with that position. And no, it's not very efficient. No, most people dread having to go get in that line, but it works. And if you are patient enough and have enough time to go through that hoop, you will get your paper stamped, you'll get a new driver's license, or you'll pass the test, or you'll get your car registered. You can go through all of that process. But it makes more efficient and better processes also impossible. Because if somebody says, oh, I know a better way, hey, we could reorganize this like that. In a bureaucracy, it's like, shh, sit down, be quiet, do what we tell you. So that's the purpose of bureaucracy, is to create a floor. And some places we need that floor. We don't want our government to get below, to slip below a certain level of competency and a certain level of integrity. So we have a floor that prevents it from doing that. And the same, the big news media or anything else, any big corporations like that, it keeps quality and production and efficiency at a floor level, but the people can't be creative. People can't really do much in that kind of a thing. They don't have the freedom. They don't have the decision space. See, everybody's decision space is squeezed down into just a little bit of decision space in that bureaucracy or in that corporation. And you're wasting a huge amount of human potential when you do that. So though that organization, that hierarchical organization, looks like it might be low entropy, it has also components of it that are high entropy. That's why, I guess in the last 20 years, corporations have been trying to get flatter. That's the kind of the new model for corporations, to make them flatter, get rid of all those levels, because they know that actually works better than if you have deep bureaucracy through lots of levels. But typically it doesn't work out too well, because the people running them are fear-based, just like those warlords that we were talking about. And when you're fear-based, you may make the organization flatter, but you don't really change the way you think about reality, the way you think about people, the way you think about getting business done. So what happens is we think this is better, we're convinced this is better, but it never seems to change much of anything. Everything just keeps on keeping on about the same, because the people running it are about the same. They're making changes at the intellectual level, but not at the being level. In other words, they're acting rather than being in that change. So many things look like they're lower entropy if all you do is look at the facade. But that's not how one computes entropy. You have to look at the entire system and everything that gets affected.
Thank you for that. And another part of his question was, he started out by saying life is a balance. I thought life was a balance between order and randomness. Do you know where this idea comes from?
Yes, it comes from a mistaken concept that because randomness, disorder is always with us. It comes from an observation that randomness is always with us. We begin to have the idea that it's a balance. The reason it's always with us, and the reason we can't seem to change it, here's this balance, here's the randomness, and here's the order. And though the order being much higher than the randomness seemed like a good idea, you have more order, less randomness, it never seems to go that way. It doesn't It's just sometimes if you have a totalitarian government, then the randomness goes higher, even if it looks like it's more ordered. We've just been through that. But in general, we've never seemed to be able to do this for very long. And we've never even done that for very long, because this with high disorder isn't stable. And this isn't stable either with the high order. So the philosophy has come that, well, it's an interplay, it's a mingle. It's always like this, and the idea is to keep it balanced. Don't get too much control, don't get too much freedom, just keep it, if you get too much freedom, people act badly, you get too much control, people act badly, and we need to keep it balanced. That observation is only true in a culture or in a population where the people are very fearful. If the people are fearful, that becomes true. That because the more order, the lower entropy, actually the people aren't changing. They're just acting differently. Because they're not really growing up and changing themselves, they're just going to flatten their organizational structure, but they still have the same old attitudes, that they had before. They're just trying on a new set of clothes, but it doesn't really change anything. So we do this. We seesaw around, and sometimes it's this way, and both seem like they're excessive. If there's too much freedom, that's a problem. Why is it a problem? Because you have a lot of population that's fearful. And if you give those fearful people too much freedom, they start doing ugly things. They start doing inconsiderate things, self-centered things. They start groping and grabbing and doing all the things that fearful people do. Okay, so then you put too much, you squeeze them and give them rules and give them laws and rules, and now, okay, you got them all marching in step, but you've squelched their creativity. You sculpt individuality, because you're not only keeping down the rowdy bunch, you're keeping down everybody. And there's no way to just let the nice people have the more freedom and the bad people more rules. You can't do that, you see. Everybody gets the more freedom. Everybody, we're all interactive. So that's been the problem. So people believe that, but that's because they've never been in a culture or in a society that wasn't primarily peopled by fear-based people. So it seems that that's impossible. That yes, we're just trying to not get to excess on either side. We just find that nice balance, and that's where we end up. So that's where it comes from. But what's wrong about it is people can change. They can grow up. They can lower their entropy to where it's not that they're acting kinder, they really are kinder. It's not that they're acting cooperative, but they are cooperative. You see, you can make a bunch of rules and it'll make people look like they're being cooperative. All right, all of you people here, go over and do this with those people, and they'll do this, and you make lots of rules, and then you back off and you look at it and you say, oh, look at all those people cooperating. Well, they look like they're cooperating, but they're not. They're just following rules. There's a difference between, the actions that people do and the intents. The forces that make them do it are very different. So I'm talking about people growing up, becoming love. They're not just acting more caring. They're not acting like it's about other. They're not acting like, okay, they get along with all the people in the office because that's what's required. In the office, we don't talk about religion. In the office, we don't talk about politics because everybody has to get along. Okay, so it looks like, well, look at all those people and they get along real well. But you see, that's false. They're people full of fear, and they're being forced, if you will. They have structures and laws and things that make them appear to be cooperative. I'm talking about real cooperation, not forced by rules. I'm talking they're cooperative because they want to, because they care about other people. They care about optimizing their society. That's why they're cooperative. So if you had people more grown up, lower entropy, higher quality of consciousness, then that thing wouldn't be true. we could just make it more and more, evolved, higher and higher quality, and that could just go up and this other thing could just go down, and it'd stay that way, and it would be stable because the people would change to support it. But until the people change, it's going to be like this, and it's going to seem like, well, the best we can do is just kind of keep it even. So that's where it comes from. It's an attitude that's born of what we see is fundamental and has to always be that way. That's the flaw. It's not fundamental. It doesn't have to always be that way.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, yeah, I felt like there was something wrong with the idea that life is about a balance between order and randomness as well. I came from a slightly different angle, but I was thinking of like the idea of when you write a book, you're lowering entropy. You're taking the alphabet, you're taking letters, 26 letters, and you're organizing them into some sort of fashion that's lower entropy, that carries content for people. Mm-hmm. But you would never look at that book and say, this book has too much content in it. Maybe I should balance it out with some randomness and then make all the even chapters just gibberish. Like, that doesn't seem like something that we do. Our goal seems to be to lower entropy. So that's why I didn't feel like that was the idea that life is a balance between order and randomness. It didn't seem like it fit with MBT.
No, it doesn't. We can evolve beyond the randomness, beyond the negativity. We have that ability. It's possible. We have to change ourselves in order to do it. There's another philosophy very similar that says, like the good and evil have to be a balance. That the negativity and the positiveness has to be in a balance of some sort. There's always going to be negativity and there's always going to be evil. And as long as those two stay in balance, then everything's fine. Because if you had too much negativity, well, that's obvious why that would be bad. But if you had too much positiveness, the problem is now the positiveness starts to become not positive anymore. And they need that negativity in order to challenge them. They just kind of, it's like, if everything's positive, what do the angels do? They sit around on clouds all the time and play their harps. It gets to be boring and non-productive, and people grow up because of the challenges, and the challenges come from that negative side. So we need to balance that. But again, it's the same idea. These ideas come from a mistaken idea that the negative is necessary to support the positive. It isn't. That positive can just grow and evolve, and the whole system can go up. Instead of being here, the whole system can do this at higher levels. You're always going to have some negativity, but the basic level, the platform it's in, can go on up. And we've seen that over time. If you look at the culture we had 500 years ago, it was a lot tougher, a lot harder, a lot less people-centered, a lot more violent, a lot more random than it is now. Everybody watched that, what was it, Game of Thrones and other such things that talk about the ways things were. Well, those are made up stories, but they're based on the way things were about 500 years ago or so, or longer. Life was very cheap. So yes, we still have negativity, but that whole thing's gone up a little bit. And now we've raised that bar. We're not that uncaring of other people. We don't have the same warlord mentality that we still have warlords around, no doubt, but we don't have that mentality in our culture like they did then. So we're growing up, and it's different. We've made progress. And my point is that progress can continue to where that negative side gets more and more positive. As that positive side gets more and more positive, and the negative side, the whole thing can go up. It doesn't have to, it's not required to balance. You could get to the theoretical point that everything was positive and the negative goes to 0 and the positive side goes to 1. So everybody's positive or nobody's negative. Unlikely to happen because we don't have a fixed number of individuated units of consciousness. If there were like N of us, whatever that is, right now it's 7.5 billion, but if it just stayed that way and you always had the same number of entities, then perhaps eventually they'd all learn and they'd all grow up, and then you'd have everybody 100% all grown up. But it's not fixed. There's new coming in all the time. Population increases, and some people de-evolve. They make poor choices, and they're going in the opposite direction. So you're always going to have this mix. But let's raise the basic level, at which this mix oscillates about. That's the point. So it's not a throw up your hands and, the random and the constructive and destructive need to be balanced. No, the destructive needs to change and stop being destructive. The constructive needs to grow up, grow more, and become even more constructive.
Well, thank you, Tom. Yeah, that's definitely an interesting way to look at it. I didn't think of it like that, but that makes sense. I'm going to move on to another question that this same professor asked me. He asked me this during the Q&A. He said, he was sort of referring to your theory. He says, you're talking about the detriments of fear a lot, but to be fair, shouldn't you talk about the detriments of love too? And he was saying, doesn't love blind people?
No, love does not blind people. When you think of love blinding people, you think of people that because of their caring and love, they make poor choices. Okay, so maybe it's an enabler of an alcoholic or a drug addict. And because you love them, they're your son or your daughter or your mother or somebody, you keep sending them money and they're just buying more drugs with it. So you become an enabler. And isn't that love creating, poor choices? No, it isn't. It's not the love that creates the poor choices. It's the fear that creates the poor choices. The reason that person keeps sending that money isn't because of their love. It's because of their fear of what happens when they stop sending that money. That's the problem. Love doesn't have a downside. Fear really doesn't have an upside. People try to make fear have an upside, like, well, fear is a good thing. If you didn't have any fear, you'd walk out in front of automobiles, you'd stand on train tracks, you'd go out in the woods and during grizzly bear mating season, you'd play with poisonous snakes if you had no fear. No, of course you wouldn't. You do those things if you're stupid. Not because you're fearless. Just because you're fearless doesn't mean you're going to jump off the first cliff that you get to. To be fearless, also, you have to be smart. You have to be clever. If you have to go out in the woods because you need to, because that's the only way you can get to grandma's house and grandma's in trouble, then you need to be well educated. You need to have your pepper spray, your air horn, know whether you should look the bear in the eye or whether you should look someplace else. What antagonizes the bear. You have to have information and be prepared. All of that you can have and be fearless. So fearless people still need to be intelligent. You can't have, you can't mix being fearless and being stupid. They don't go together. So no, being fearful is all downside. If you're fearful and you have to go out in the woods anyway, you're more likely to get mauled by a bear than if you're not, because that fearful state puts out a pheromone that bear can smell for probably 3 miles and is drawn to it like a magnet. You smell like bear bait when you're fearful. You smell like prey when you're fearful. When you're fearful and you see that bear, you'll probably freeze. Bad thing. Worst thing is you'll run, which is what prey does. It runs. And an animal then will have an instinct to chase. So being fearful will cause you to do the wrong things, and even the pheromones, there's nothing, even if you are also intelligent and know about bears and fearful, you're still lowering your probability of success just by being fearful. And when you're fearful, you're never as coordinated, or you don't have as good reaction times. Fearful wads you up. You have to be relaxed. You have to be able to move. You have to be able to be smart. And all of that you're a lot better at if you're not fearful.
Yeah. So like one of the examples he used, he said, well, like, because he asked another question about, isn't fear useful? And he said, well, isn't like the fear of climate change, doesn't that help us overcome it? But what you're saying is that, no, we'd actually be even better at overcoming climate change without the fear.
Exactly. What the fear does is create divisiveness. So we are afraid of climate change. The fear then creates anger. Anger is a subset of fear. So if you fear it, then you start to get angry. When you get angry, you start shouting and calling names. When you do that, the people on the other side start pushing back. And pretty soon you have this situation polarized. You've got the pros and the cons, the people that really care about it and the people that deny it. And the more you polarize it, the more nothing changes. The more you make it you create a situation that doesn't have a solution. Because once it gets polarized, nobody wants to back up. The people who say, nah, climate change is stupid, the more you push at them, the more they back up into that belief, the stronger they believe it. So all you do is make things worse. Polarization is never the place where things get done. People's minds get changed. People see things. Once it goes to polarization, then everybody's hardened in their positions. The angry get angrier, and the people who are pushing back push back harder. And change gets less likely. And any changes are very small, and you get stalemate. It doesn't work. So the fear is not helpful. Fear of the climate change is not a good thing. Again, what you want is intelligence. You want people to think and say, yeah, okay, greenhouse gases. Yeah, we're doing all this. And no, we're not doing much to stop it. And yes, here's the rates. And, you look at the science and you say, this is a real problem. We need to do something about it. And because it's a real problem, you act on it and you go talk to the people who are making the greenhouse gases and try to educate them as well, not by banging on their door and screaming at them and calling them names. That will make them not cooperate with you. You see, you have to handle it in a way that is non-confrontational. That is much more likely to work than one that's confrontational. That will end up in polarization, and you have fearful people. People are another result of fear is beliefs. And fearful people with beliefs generally push back. So you go to somebody who's fearful and you try to talk to them. If you come at them with force, guaranteed you're going to get them to retrench and be even stronger in their beliefs. Beliefs are irrational. You can't overcome a belief with rationality. So rather than forcing two camps into irrational beliefs and anger, you have a higher probability if you approach it in a positive way. You see, and we don't get polarized. So, no, the fear of climate change is not helpful. It hurts. It keeps us from doing anything. Why have we gone as long as we have in this country, doing as little as we have? Well, because we got it polarized right away. Everything we do these days is, we can't sit down anymore around a table and talk about the facts. Everything gets polarized very quickly. Team A versus Team B, red versus blue, and everything turns into that kind of a pushing contest, which means nothing happens much. And fear is part of the problem. Understanding is the solution. To get somebody to understand what they don't understand now, You have to work with them, not demand, not bully. You have to work with them. Now, maybe you can get enough votes so that the people that agree with you get voted in. Well, then you can make changes that way. But now, you're back to a force versus force thing. That takes years. It takes a lot longer, even if you're successful. And how long might you be successful? 4 years or 8 years, and then it goes the other way. Much better to take that time to educate positively, talk about the science, but we don't do that. So no, fear of climate change, fear of whatever, fear of the bad things isn't a good thing. You think, well, fear of the bad things will make people do the good things if they fear the bad things. No, it doesn't. It causes often just the opposite. Most of the things we do out of fear are dysfunctional. Parents fear that their children are going to become druggies and have poor friends. So they watch every move they make. They're very demanding. They begin to run their lives. They look at everything that happens, and what happens, that structure, just like living under a totalitarian government, that structure makes that child want to rebel, want to get out of there, want to do their own thing. And are you saving that child from doing drugs? No. You're probably pushing them into having to do drugs, just despite all the pushing and the demands and how you've inserted into their life and all of their thoughts. So fear-based solutions generally carry a negative component with them. Mm-hmm. Non-fear-based solutions don't. So that's the difference. So the non-fear-based thing is you give your kids some trust, you talk to them, you help them understand things, and then you let them make their own choices. And if your kids grow up in that kind of a family, they don't mind confiding in the parents of what's going on and the things that happen, and they'll tell you rather than you having to drag it out of them or make them carry a thing with them that tracks them all the time or whatever. They will learn how to get around those kinds of devices, and they will have less respect for you, your parent, the parent, and the parent's ideas. So if you want to affect your kids positively, fear is not the way to teach them. We try to make them fearful of those bad things, thinking that will help, but it doesn't. Educate them. That helps.
So fear is not, it's not necessary. It's not helping us.
No, it doesn't help. It comes always, even if we're trying to apply it in a positive way, it always comes with a negative. There's always a black lining in that cloud someplace. Mm-hmm. And often that black lining will dominate, depends on how much we push, other people.
Yeah.
So yeah, the fear, like I said, the fear of the bears, it comes with a black lining, and that is that you smell like prey. Mm-hmm. It always seems to be that way. Whereas you just deal positive with it, then you don't have that negative aspect that you have to deal with.
Makes sense. That makes sense. Thank you. So I have another question here. This professor, she watched my presentation, and she pointed out that you say physicalism is the dominant theory, talking about me in my presentation. You say physicalism is the dominant theory in the Western world, yet 70% of Westerners are Christian. So I pointed in the video of my presentation, I said that the Western world is dominated by physicalism. But then in the next breath, I mentioned how 70% of Westerners are Christian. So I'm just trying to figure out, I know you say that physicalism is kind of the view of the West. Mm-hmm. In what sense is that true? Because that fact, 70% of Westerners being Christian, that seems to contradict it. And also our criminal justice system assumes free will, in a sense, which is denied by physicalism.
Yeah. In order to see that as conflicting, you have to have an assumption that people are rational. People are not rational. People are full of beliefs. People are full of fear. We kind of got that out at the beginning. You know, people are generally fearful. That's the way they are. Fearful people are irrational people. Fear is never rational, which is what we just were talking about. It's not the rational way to go. It's a belief-based way that, you know, it doesn't work very well. So the reason that I say that materialism is kind of the fundamental worldview in the West is that that's basically true. That is, we think that science defines truth. And I've often called the scientists, you know, the high priests of Western culture. Well, the high priests are the people that tell everyone else what to believe. Well, the scientists have become that in our culture. The scientists say this is the way it is, you know, this is the nature of reality. And everybody says, well, you know, the scientists say that, that's their job. It's kind of complicated and I don't really understand it. So, you know, science is the truth, scientific method, experimentation, careful people doing careful things. So that's the truth. Well, science is very much materialistic based. Their basic understanding of the nature of reality is that this is a big machine. And they're trying to figure out how the machine works. You know, and what parts affect other parts, and how do they affect them? You know, so that's science. And that's why I say that that's dominant in our culture. Our culture kind of believes that that's the way it is. That doesn't mean that the people in the culture can't have contradictory beliefs and just don't notice the contradiction. They do. All sorts of things like that, and particularly religious people. Religious people have all sorts of contradictions. Even the scientists themselves are full of contradictions. That's because fearful people are not rational people. By saying not rational, I don't mean that everything they do is irrational. I mean they have irrational aspects to themselves. So you will have people who would internally, and we just get this from the culture. It's not that somebody teaches these people. It's not that somebody, you know, in kindergarten says, you know, this is a materialist reality. You just get it by being in the culture. It's part of the collective consciousness. It's part of what we get culturally, is that this material world is it. And it's a steady, it's a machine. You do an experiment, everybody can do that same experiment and get that same result. It's fixed. You know, that's the material idea. That stuff's real. That's what we define as real, as material things. And most people will say that. If you say, well, is this chair I'm sitting in, is that real? And they say, of course. Well, I had a dream the other day, and when I was dreaming, I sat in a chair. Was that real? No. That was just a dream. That wasn't real. You see, so the real world is this physical world, and everything else is not real. That's just generally the way people feel. Now, the fact at the same time that they're religious and believe that you know, there's a spiritual component to life, that is logically inconsistent with materialism and determinism, it never crosses their mind. They're religious not because they're theologians who have thought about religion deeply. They're religious because their parents were religious. They're probably not even religious. They just go to church because their parents went to church. And their parents went to church because their grandparents went to church. Mm-hmm. And it's just a habit of the culture because all their neighbors go to church. And because church has dances on Saturday night for the young people. And because the church has, you know, goes bowling and skating and, you know, picnics and other kinds of things. The church is a social institution. So they go to church, and if you ask them, they say, oh yeah, I'm a member of such and such church and I'm a Christian. The fact that that is incompatible logically with some other of their beliefs is never crosses their mind. And if it's pointed out to them, they will simply ignore it, evade it, say, well, yeah, but that really doesn't, it's not like that, and they just won't go there. So everybody does not live a logically consistent life. Almost nobody does. That's rare. Most people make their choices based on their fear, their egos, their beliefs. Probably 80% of people's choices are irrational. Their feelings, their fears, their beliefs, that's what moves most of their choices, and none of that stuff's rational. So this idea that people are logical little entities only, doing logical things is a fallacy. They're not like that at all. So yes, you can have, 75, 80% of the world. Well, if we take just religious of some sort, or at least consider themselves religious, it's going to be a high percentage. There's also, here's another little factoid, is that 75 to 80% of all the people queried or interviewed or whatever it is pollsters do, say that they have themselves experienced something paranormal. And that's contradictory to a belief in materialism.
Right.
Scientists say, the paranormal things are impossible because they're not part of the machine. They're in mind space, and there is no mind space. That's an illusion. Remember, consciousness is an illusion when you're in that camp. So, but yet 70% have experienced some sort of 70% or greater have experienced some sort of paranormal event themselves. But that, if you then ask them, is this chair the real thing? Is that reality? They're still going to say yes. They don't see any logical inconsistency. So the fact that it's logically inconsistent is, well, that's just the way people are, who are full of beliefs and fear. They and don't expect them to be rational. Irrationality is just part of life. Why do we make the choices we make? Because it makes us feel better. Because that's what we want to do. That's not logic. Logic doesn't drive us to do that. And even if you find philosophy professors who specialize in logic and teach logic, you will still find that most of their decisions in their life are made based on their feelings, their wants, their needs, their desires, not on logic. Mm-hmm. Because logic, deductive logic, requires a lot of information for things to be logical. And almost everything in life doesn't come, all the choices, in life, those decisions in that decision space doesn't come with enough information to make a deductive logical choice. All the big things, little tiny things, yes, you can make logical choices, like where did I leave my glasses? Well, logic would say, where were you last time you had them? Then where did you go after that? And if you have a good memory, you can kind of reconstruct things. And that would be logic. But for things that are more meaningful in your life, like, should I marry this person? And if I do, should we have 2 children or 6 children? And should I take this job or should I take that job? All of these things, well, you don't know. You don't have enough information to make a deductive conclusion on all the big important things in your life. Well, if you don't have enough information, then a deductive logical result is impossible. So what do? You go with the gut. You go with what feels good. You think about it and take a guess. So most of our life, particularly the important things, are not logical. Most of our choices are not logical. And the opposite of logical, I'll call just, they're not rational. We're guessing. You don't have really good reasoning. Our reasoning is based on assumptions and beliefs and fears. That's what drives our reasoning. And it's the fear that drives the belief and the ego. So fear is not rational, not helpful, but that's what drives our answers. So people are very seldom rational. So I would never look and say, well, look, there's a conflict between these two beliefs that the people have, right? People are like that.
Yeah.
There's a lot of scientists and they will tell you that this is a machine and it's something that is the material world is the real world and the only real world. And they go to church every Sunday, but they're still determinists.
Yeah, that's a good point. We're definitely not rational. That's what it comes down to.
No, people are not rational. We don't live our life on logic. Goodness, look at the electorate. Look at how we vote. Talk about people being irrational. Voting these days, in the days where everything is polarized, has all to do with emotion and feelings. And the more polarized they are, the more, the better for whoever's polarizing them. Each team tries to polarize their own people. Rather than having discussions, we just have shouting matches. We don't have discussions anymore. It's impossible to discuss anything political. It's, right. We don't have debates. Even the debates we have, they're not generally about anything meaningful. It's all sound bites and trying to say something clever that has emotional impact that will pull people your way. It's all about marketing, not about getting at the truth. We're not concerned with truth. We're concerned with appearance and belief. So, I'm afraid that rationality and logic has a very small space in the decision-making process.
Okay, yeah, no, thank you for that. That makes sense. One of the professors that watched my presentation, she was telling me how she likes the theory and she's interested in it. And I think she likes how it resonates with Buddhism a bit, but she told me that the acronyms, AUO, IUOC, they didn't really resonate with her, and it was kind of off-putting for her personally. What would you say to someone who feels that way about your theory?
Well, I would agree with her. I use acronyms probably for a couple of reasons. One is, I come out of a technical world, and I spend a lot of my time working inside of the DoD world and NASA and other, I've worked for big aerospace companies, and all those companies are awash with acronyms because they do a lot of government contracts, and the government is awash with acronyms.
Yeah.
So I lived in an acronym space, and that just was natural to me to speak in acronyms because that's one of the things. And I tried to use them as little as possible, but mostly I use the words, I refer to a thing. And if every time I refer to this thing, it has a name that's 4 or 5 words long, like the AUOO, AUO and these things, this. And if every time I say that, I go through this big, people would get annoyed with that as well.
Yeah, of course.
They get very, if I've got this 5-word thing that appears in every third sentence, they get real tired of rereading all that stuff. So the acronym makes it simpler to read. But the problem is, and the acronym actually contains the definition of the thing. So I try to make the acronym not just a random 3 letters or something. I make the acronym be the definition of the thing that I'm using. So if you want to know what an AUO is, well, it's what is it? No, I can't even remember it. Unbounded oneness.
Absolute unbounded oneness.
Absolute unbounded oneness. So you get that idea. But if I said that over and over and over again, that would be annoying. So it's how do you want to annoy people? With repeating phrases a lot. So what I want to do is I want to take a phrase that defines itself in its words, reduce it to something small, and people have trouble remembering what the words are that goes with the acronym. Well, obviously I did. That was probably now 15, 16, 17 years ago that I wrote it. I don't use the acronyms. I don't use that acronym. I haven't much after I read it. I generally call it larger consciousness system now because that seemed even better, easier to comprehend than the other. So anyhow, it's inherently difficult to remember what the letters stand for. And in my book, I get to a point where I talk about that. I say, okay, folks, I know you're having trouble with the acronyms. It's just the way your brain works. When you have an acronym, it is very difficult for your brain to make the association between the three letters and the name. And it's just the mechanics of the way the brain works. It's very hard for the brain to make that association stick. It's in your mind for a little bit. The next day you come and you say, oh, what was that? What does that mean? And the advice I give them in the book, I said, that acronym, don't worry about what it stands for. Have a sense of the concept and let the acronym be just a name for the concept. So just like the character's name is Fred, let AUO just be like Fred. Don't every time you look at it feel like you have to go pull up all the words. That's what's annoying. Just get a sense, okay, AUO, that's the source. Fine, it's all you need to know. And when you see it, say, that means source. And from then on, you don't have problems. You know that AUO means the source. And you don't have to get your brain to come up with the things for each letter. And as soon as people get that, then the acronyms cease to be annoying. Now, the reason why those acronyms kind of are off the wall, and she couldn't relate to them very well, is that my work is actually very supportive, or very, can we say, gets along very well with Buddhism. Much of Hinduism as well, is supported. A lot of things that they say, I agree with. I say the same. There's a big difference, though, in the way I say it. Mine is a scientific model, a logical model, and you can take the logic in this model and derive physics from it and find things in physics that aren't known yet. You can understand things like why is the speed of light a constant, and why should quantum mechanics be based on probability, that things only exist by probability when a measurement's made. Why is it like that? So it answers those kinds of questions, which are unanswered questions. So it's a logical model that can be extrapolated into science very successfully. It's a little harder to do that with Buddhism. Buddhism is more of a poetic model. It's more of a model that you have to interpret what's being said and what does it mean. All right, Bhagavad Gita, you got this guy in a chariot and he's in the middle of some sort of war and he's saying these things, and it's really not about the war at all. It's all metaphorical. It's all about symbols and understanding. And there's a lot of wisdom in there if you know how to untangle it from what's literally presented. But if you don't know how to untangle it from what's literally presented, you'll get in about 10 pages and you'll throw it away because it won't make any sense to you. You won't get very far in it. Mine is more logical. You start, you look at the assumptions, and it just marches you through logically. Why is it like this? So Buddha says this is an illusion. I say this is a virtual reality. Well, virtual reality wasn't a concept 2,500 years ago, when the Buddha was thinking these thoughts, when Siddhartha was sitting under his tree. So it's updated metaphors, if you will, to make it easier for people to follow it as a logical process, not a poetical process. It doesn't have to be interpreted. It just has to be understood. And you can understand it with rationality, with logic, not that you have to really understand the concepts before you can understand the concepts, which is the way it is when you practice, with Buddhism or something like that. That's why the learning of the concepts takes a long time, because you can't really understand what's written in the Bhagavad Gita until you really understand what the concepts are. Mm-hmm. And the more you understand the concept and you go back and reread it, oh, I see more what they meant with that, and you kind of grow in your ability to decipher it. So mine's a little easier for the modern person to read because I'm using modern metaphors that the person knows how to interpret better than a guy, at war on his chariot. It's really hard to interpret in the 21st century. It doesn't really have the same kind of feel to it that it may have had 2,000 years ago. So I made my acronyms up, and I used different words than, say, Buddhism would use, because I didn't want people to come to it with any preconceived notions. So I talk about experience packets. Buddhism talks about reincarnation. Well, they're the same sort of thing, but I didn't call it reincarnation because reincarnation is a part of one of those Eastern religion things, don't you know? And that is already off-putting to a lot of people. So I tried to take my concepts and put them in a language that was just available and accessible to people with logic, could read it without having any emotional baggage attached to the words that I use or connect it to any other, existing set of thought. And I didn't know a whole lot about Buddhism. After I'm finished, I found that it was very, very close to most of the principles in Buddhism. Very, very close. Matter of fact, it's very much in line with almost all of what's called the mystery, or not mystery, what is it? Mystical groups. Let's see, you have mystical groups in almost all religions. You have the Sufi. You have the what were they in Christianity? They were the Gnostics.
Gnostic.
Yeah, you have the Gnostics, and you have in Judaism, it's the Kabbalists. So people who have studied those things will often say, Tom, are you a Kabbalist expert? Are you a Sufi expert? Your ideas just fit in real perfectly. So I fit into these schools very, very well, including Buddhism. So that's because the truth is the truth. There's only one truth, but there's millions of ways to express that truth. And I tried to express it in a way that was logical, with up-to-date metaphors that people could relate to, and without any emotional baggage to any other way of thinking. So I suspect if I had used a lot of the metaphors that Buddhism used, this particular professor would have found it a lot easier to understand what it was I was talking about, because she already was probably familiar with those metaphors. And it was a little frustrating because she thought, well, I think I understand what he says, but if he just said reincarnation, I would have had it. But now I have to go back and study what he means by an experience packet. So yes, it makes it a little hard to grok for some, but it opens it up to others. my whole point in writing the books was to produce an on-ramp to a bigger picture, to the left brain logical set of folks who tend to be materialists and tend to be tied up in logical process, because those folks don't have any on-ramps to the bigger picture. I'm taking them to a place that agrees very strongly with all these mystical traditions, without them ever knowing that a mystical tradition has anything to do with it. Otherwise, they wouldn't pick it up in the first place, because they're hard-headed logic people.
I think your theory, it's good. It's showing that like you don't have to abandon logic if you want to be spiritual. I think before, this is like a mindset, like either you're Christian or you're part of some religion, or you're an atheist who says, particles are the only thing that exists and you are, inanimate matter. But you're showing how like, no, spirituality can be logical. And
Absolutely.
that's what I love about the theory. And that's what's very unique about MBT.
Yes, there's no, matter of fact, it can be so logical that the very same principles that the consciousness and, the subjective parts, consciousness is a subjective thing. It's not an objective thing. Everybody's conscious. Everybody lives in their own reality to some extent. That the very same principles that explain consciousness in the subjective world also explain physics. So physics is derivable from the metaphysics. It's derivable from the subjective, literally derivable. You can derive and you can understand the physics much better from that perspective. And yes, I've got some physics experiments ongoing now that are to validate some of these points, and we'll get to that whenever they get done. It's a little disappointing that they've taken so long, but they are chugging away in a laboratory in Southern California. California Polytech is doing the work.
Great.
So in any case, yes, this is completely a logical process. And, for those who are more right-brained and open to religious or the idea of the paranormal or the idea of spiritual existence, there's lots of books for those people to read. Lots of them. There's a whole, 6 or 8, 10 feet in the bookstore that's dedicated just to that. But your left brain, live out of their head types can't read that. They get into the first chapter and it's like, where's the proof? This is all a bunch of assumptions. This is baloney. There are people who are just making this up. There's nothing here, this is all subjective blather. And they throw it down. They can't read it. There's no on-ramp for them to say, oh, okay, that's logical. Oh, okay, I see that leads here. That's logical. They don't have that on-ramp. So I wrote my book for the left brain, live out of your head, logical folks, the doctors, the lawyers, even the architects, even the people who, work in contracting, the people who build houses, all of these people live out of their logic. They all live by how things work, not why things work. They're not into what's behind the curtain. They're all into just what's in front of the curtain that I can work with. And they can't read those philosophical texts that get outside of the physical concrete world because they're not logical. So that's what I wanted to produce, a set of books that those kind of people could read. And they could see that this idea that our reality is more than just the physical is logical.
Absolutely.
It's not just a thing that you have to believe or not believe. It's logical. To say that there is no non-physical component is illogical.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a big step. But I've had any number of people, actually, when I do events and a lot of people come, I'd say half of the people there are left brain techies. You know, they're programmers, they're scientists, they're doctors, they're people who, engineers, I get a lot of engineers, a lot of computer scientists, they get it very quickly. And for them, it's a big aha, because they've been rejecting all of this all their lives. And now they realize that, oh, you know, there might be something to it. And I always tell people, don't believe what I tell you. This is not the point. I'm not trying to get you to believe. I don't want to put another layer of belief over whatever beliefs you've already got. Just experiment with it, do it, live it, see what happens. You know, it's a experiential kind of a thing, not a belief thing. I resist being put in that, you know, category of, you know, this is the truth, believe me. I've been there, believe me. I don't like that at all. I don't want to be a guru. I don't want to be somebody that people believe. I don't want to start a religion. I just offer a logical model that if it makes sense to you and you can find yourself, you know, your own experience in my model. If you can say, oh yeah, that's me, you know, that's the way I think. Those are my issues. If you find yourself in this model, then use it. And if you don't, throw it away. I don't want to start a belief. So I'm probably the only speaker that when I get done speaking, I tell people to not believe anything I've told them, that they have the capacity to find out for themselves, to see if it works the way I say it works. Because like you said, all of this is very applicable to everyday life. And if you understand it, it'll totally change your life, totally change your viewpoint. And you don't have to believe it or not believe it. Just do what works. Yeah. If it doesn't work, toss it out.
Yeah. And I could say your theory, it's very difficult. You made it very difficult to misinterpret the way you were so clear. I think with a lot of New Age spiritual theories and ideas, they can be easy to misinterpret. They're not very clear. So that's what I liked about your theory. Yeah. See, I had thought that the universe was a simulation before I got into your work, but the theories I was looking at, they weren't as clear as yours. It wasn't as clear as how it came into being or who created it. You know, was it evil aliens? Was it a future human race? But yours was very clear, logical.
Yeah. Well, I'm a physicist. That's the way I had to build it. You know, that was the hard part, is to write it down in such a way that I didn't throw in assumptions. You know, just the minimum amount of things that had to be said to get there. Yeah. So actually, like, there's really only one assumption, and that's that consciousness exists. The rest of it is just logical.
Yeah.
It just makes sense. But you have to start with consciousness exists, because that's what we are. We can't get outside of consciousness to see how consciousness existed. So we're kind of stuck there. But I don't find that to be a big jump of a thing to assume. It's a whole lot simpler assumption than to say that we're a simulation by future humanoids, this and that. There's a lot of illogical things you can find in that. Well, if that's the case, then, you know, if this is just a simulation, it must not be a very interesting one. You're telling me that there's future humans that are watching us, you know, sleep all night and go to the bathroom and do all the things that we do that are boring and not very interesting and so on, that they wouldn't make this game more interesting. And if that's the case, then all the paranormal things disappear, because it's another physical thing doing physical things, and paranormal just wouldn't exist, can't exist. Well, you know, there's no way to do that. And of course, we know those paranormal things do exist, and that's facts as well. And all you need is one example of it existing to know that it's possible. And there's thousands of facts of it happening. So you know it's possible. And once you know it's possible, then it's a matter of controlling it. Can you control it? Can you do it whenever you want to? However you want to? What are its limitations and the rest of it? And all of that's just a matter of time and practice. So that's the idea. And if one thinks that the paranormal things are not possible and don't exist, well, I'd say for a couple of weeks worth of study on the internet should convince any open mind that indeed they are possible. They've been studied by reputable people, universities, and so on, and research for many, many years. And of course they're possible. They're not only possible, but they happen to a lot of people. 70% of the population even, it's possible.
Well, in my presentation, I compared your theory a lot to Christianity, and I kind of, I highlighted the differences that were there, but maybe it's a little more, maybe what's more important is the fact that your theory is inclusive in it. Physicalism and Christianity can both plug into your theory. So I was wondering if you could just talk a little bit about how those two theories plug into yours, and I can chime in too with some things that I noticed that were in common with Christianity as I was doing my research.
Yeah, well, my model is not only consistent with Christianity, I should put it this way. My model is consistent with the fundamental aspects of Christianity. My model is inconsistent with the dogma associated with Christianity. So that's the difference. The fundamentals of Christianity go very well with my model. And that's true of Buddhism, Hinduism, Kabbalah, Sufism. All of those are compatible with my model. A lot of the belief systems of indigenous people, cultures that go back millennia, it's very much supportive of them as well. So it makes connections into all of those things. Not just Christianity, but it is not in line with and is in conflict with dogma.
Yeah.
So none of the dogma in any of those things, does it really support. So it's the concepts, it's the big ideas that it's consistent with.
Yeah, I took some notes of certain things of Christianity that I felt did resonate with MBT. For instance, when I was trying to summarize Christianity for this presentation, I came across something called the 7 deadly sins, in which these are emotions that if you embody, they're said to lead to all other sins. So they're like the root of all other problems in the world. And I felt like this very much relates to what you could call Tom Campbell's 1 deadly sin, which is fear. This being right at the root. And then also, of course, God, that's in a way, it's similar to AUO or the LCS.
Right, larger conscious system, same idea, source.
Yep, we have a source. And then, Jesus and God, especially Jesus, he talks about love and forgiveness being the way. Love is the answer.
Right.
This is definitely at the core of your model. Prayer, that sort of resonates with, you talk about we can modify the future probability with our intention. Yep. And then also, I think in Christianity, they talk about a soul and a body, which is like the IUOC and an avatar in your theory.
Right.
So, and then of course, physicalism plugs in too. Part of our reality does work in a clockwork way. And that is an approximation of the PMR rule set. Would you say?
That's exactly right. That's where the physical is derived from the non-physical. So we have consciousness, which is an information system. Information is non-physical. Okay. Now, some people might object to that, but information is not the ink squiggles on a page of paper. It's not the type in a book. That's not the information. The information is the meaning, okay, of what those squiggles represent. That's the information. The ink squiggles on the book, the vibrations in the air, somebody speaking, they're not the information. That's a physical thing. So ink is physical, paper is physical, book is physical. And physical processes can transfer data. They represent data, but it takes a consciousness to interpret that data and turn it into information. Information is the significance of those squiggles, the significance of that air pressure variations, whatever. And a consciousness has to do that. So information is non-physical. Significance is non-physical. It's not objective, it's subjective. Okay, so we mentioned earlier that the virtual reality that we call the physical universe was created in order to provide meaningful choices with consequence for individuated units of consciousness. So it's a game, if you will. And like all virtual realities, it's based on a rule set. And the rule set basically defines what can and can't be done in that virtual reality. So in some virtual reality games, you can teleport and you can fly and do other things. And this virtual reality, you can't do that because we have rules called physics, chemistry, biology. Those rules specify what can and can't be done here. Okay, so that's the rule set that determines how the virtual reality works. Those rules, the physics, chemistry, biology, they define the possible energy exchanges among things that can happen. How can we interact with each other? Okay, so it's, Newton's laws. Those are part of the rule set. That's the rules, plus all the other things we've learned in science. That's part of the rule set. So that rule set creates a virtual reality that we call the physical universe. So how does the non-physical and the physical connect? Well, the non-physical creates the physical as a virtual reality. And we players in that virtual reality, well, let's put it this way. We are the players of the avatars. The avatar is our body. So our body is in this interactive virtual reality, and we are the consciousness of that player. So the player is the body, we're the consciousness. We are a piece of consciousness playing this character because this character is going to give us some real interesting and challenging choices in this virtual reality. The virtual reality had to be computed because the system needed a rule set that was more constrained and tighter, such that interactions were well-defined and interactive. So everything you do here interacts with everybody else. Unless you live in a cave by yourself as a hermit, you interact with people and you change how those people interact with people, which changes how those people interact with people. So all of your choices tend to be interactive, and we're all this big hodgepodge of interaction and choices, giving us opportunities to make good choices. And as we make good choices, we evolve. As we make poor choices, we de-evolve. So the physical reality is a creation of the non-physical reality. Non-physical is more fundamental than the physical. That's why you can derive physics from understanding how the non-physical reality works. Consciousness is fundamental. Physical reality is derived. You see, so that's the key in understanding that. And I got to that early on in my research. What I did is as a physicist studying consciousness, I spent about 35 years before I wrote the book doing experiments in consciousness, trying to see what variables changed what, what did they do? Things that you could do, things that you couldn't do. And if so, why couldn't you do them? What was the connections? Why do these paranormal things sometimes work, sometimes don't? How come we have this variation? Some people seem to be able to do them and some people don't. And why is that? So just, and how do you use your mind to heal someone or to remote view or to pick up information about them, the state of their health, the state of their emotions? How do precognitive dreams work? How can someone have a dream and then, of some event and then have that event happen exactly like that dream down to the last detail? What's the mechanism there? We know those things happen. So how? Why? What are the variables? What are the variables that that make it work better, and what are the variables that make it work less well? So all of those kinds of questions, I spent a lot of years just doing trial and error research to come up with conclusions. And I call those the facts of consciousness. Now, again, these are all subjective things from my own experience. And I looked at those things, but I'm a scientist, so I needed to be able to do these things hundreds of times and repeat them in different ways, changing a variable and repeat it again 100 times, change a variable, repeat it again 100 times. It takes a long time. 35 years is about how long it took to do that. And I ended up with this set of facts about consciousness. And one of them was that consciousness is fundamental and the physical world is derivative. That was a fact. Things that I could do in the consciousness world can affect the things that happen in the physical world, but it doesn't work the other way. The things you do in the physical world do not change things around in the consciousness world. So cause and effect rolls from the more fundamental to the less fundamental. Consciousness has to be the fundamental thing, and the physical world has to be the derivative thing. So that's a fact. So I took all these consciousness facts, and I took all the physical facts, because I'm a physicist. I also know a whole lot of facts about how the world works as what the rule set says about how the world works. And I tried to come up with a model that would explain all of those facts on both sides. One consistent, simple, elegant idea that would combine them. And at the end of 35 years of doing research, I thought I had it. So I started writing the books. And as I wrote the books, I realized I didn't have it. There were all kinds of holes and things, that were assumptions, but didn't actually have logical paths to them. And I had to go back and figure all those things out and do more. And eventually, it took me 5 years to write them. Eventually, I then published the books. So because the non-physical flows from the physical, then that's the connection you're talking about. Why, how are those two connected? Well, the non-physical is the fundamental thing. Consciousness is the fundamental thing. And this reality is a product of consciousness. It has a function in the world of consciousness. It's an entropy reduction trainer for individuated units of consciousness. That's its whole sole purpose. And it's made just to do that. And the way we get feedback from it, because of this idea of you modify future probability with your intent. Now, of course, there's limitations to that, ways that you can affect it more or less, or, there's lots of variables that surround that sort of thing, but it happens. So the world that we live in is basically a world of our mutual creation. We create this world to be the way it is in many ways. Now, we don't create everything ourselves, obviously. We are interactive. There's lots of other players out there, and they affect us. And sometimes the things they do limits the things that we can do, or gives us greater things that we can do. And that's the growing thing. So if you look at the world and all of its dysfunction and all of its fear, that world is a very good representation of us, humanity. All the players that are playing human avatars here, that's the level of quality of consciousness that we have. That's the level of fear that we live at. Just go out and look at the news and look at the world, and it's a very accurate representation of people. And we have a lot of growth, potential ahead of us. We tend to be dominated by fear, but that's why we're here, trying to learn. Now, I might also say is that the larger consciousness system evolved, and I started out as the simplest system that I could imagine, because I couldn't come up with its cause, because I am consciousness myself. I could start with the simplest model of consciousness imaginable. It's like starting biology with a single cell and letting that cell evolve into everything that we have now on the planet. It's a similar kind of idea. You make the very simplest start and let that evolve and see how the pressure to lower entropy, which is what drives consciousness change, consciousness evolution, how that created the larger conscious system, how it is the way it is now because it had to be. That was the way the system evolves. It couldn't have evolved in other directions. And the technologies that it needed to invent were the technologies that had to happen in order to lower entropy. So it's all very logical how it goes together. And it answers so many questions. It answers all the questions of metaphysics. It answers all the things about epistemology. It answers the questions about ontology, cosmology, all those metaphysical things that generally a lot of hand waving and making up stories and lots of assumptions. It basically turns that into logical understandings. It takes basic philosophy and at least theology and a lot of philosophy. Philosophy's had this big argument between the realists and the idealists. It goes back to Plato and probably before in the Western thought, and it resolves that. MBT falls squarely in the idealist camp. So it kind of resolves that logically to a point that there is an answer to that. It's not a thing that's really arguable anymore. There are facts and logic that shows how that's resolved. So, in psychology, it tells us a lot about people and how they interact. It talks about, like Freudian model. It changes the Freudian model around to where we see the unconscious, or what's called the subconscious, is really not a thing that exists. It's just a space that Freud and others have stuffed everything into that they don't understand. Everything that was kind of hand waving and very speculative, because it just pops up like your fear, your anger. Nobody intellectually thinks, oh, I should be angry now. Anger just kind of wells up out of you, and sometimes it's very irrational. And where does that come from? Well, nobody knows. It's not in our intellect, therefore it's in a it's beneath the intellect, and it became the subconscious. So it became basically like a trash can where everything that we don't understand that wasn't rational got stuck in there. So our instincts got thrown in there. Our sex, our id got thrown in there. Our anger got thrown in there, and a lot of other things got thrown in there. But it turns out that subconscious is only there because we have fear. As we get rid of fear, that subconscious starts to clear out. And if we could get rid of all the fear, we wouldn't have a subconscious. We'd be perfectly aware of all of ourselves. Mm-hmm. We would accept all of ourselves. We'd be aware of every aspect. And there wouldn't be any stuff that bubbles up and we don't know where it came from, so we stick it in this basket called subconscious. We'd be aware of it all. So subconscious is really a reflection of the low quality of consciousness. So that subconscious now gets used again as just a reason for all kinds of things. A lot of people have theories, and this comes out of the subconscious and that comes out of the subconscious. That just means they don't really understand what the subconscious is, how it works. So they use it as a place where mysteries can hide. And it becomes an assumption in their model that there's this somewhat mystical subconscious and these things can hide there or come out of there. And now the subconscious becomes kind of a link to the spiritual world and other things. And none of that's the case. Subconscious is just our fear. There's some things we just can't deal with. We can't accept. And it's because we're fearful. So we bury those things under the rug, if you will. We bury them out of sight, and that becomes our subconscious. And so it modifies, my point was, it modifies psychology. It modifies sociology. So it changes all sorts of concepts. And in the world of physics, it's going to basically build a whole new foundation under physics. It answers questions about physics that are right now paradoxes. Whole bunch of paradoxes in physics get answered with this model. So it hits so many paradoxes, so many unanswered questions that gives me a warm feeling that the model has something to it. You see, for me, it's just a model. Oh, I have all these conscious facts, all these physical facts. Okay, here's a way that I can answer all of the facts, support all of those facts with one simple model. Basically, really only one assumption, and that's consciousness exists. And all of these facts fall out with logical answers that we don't have. So I think that's a good sign. But it is just a model that I created trying to do all the facts. So again, I don't want people to believe it. That would be counterproductive. I want them to experience it, see it, live it. And if it doesn't improve your life, and if it doesn't make things that were confusing to you become clear, then don't use it. And anything that you're doing that's working, do that. I don't want it to become another belief system. Belief, like fear, is not positive. Belief always is a problem. Believe nothing. Be skeptical of everything. So be skeptical of MBT model. Be skeptical of everything you hear. If it's not your experience, it can't be your truth. It's not your own experience, then it's somebody else's truth that they're telling you about. They may think it's their truth, but it can't be yours if you haven't experienced it. So you have to get out and actually be it, do it, experience it. And from there, you can create your own big toe, your own model, and keep expanding it and working on it as you grow and as you understand. And that's really what I'd like people to do, not to follow my model, but to create, my big toe is just a kind of a model, a framework for other people to start creating their own big toes, their own picture of how the reality works from their own experience. Because if they do that, they're eventually going to end up, I think, with conclusions similar to mine. But if they end up with those conclusions from their own process, then that will be meaningful. If they end up with conclusions that are similar to mine, but they just intellectually got there, then it's not useful. All they've learned is the intellectual understanding, but they don't have the change. They haven't grown to the point where they embody that change. They can act kinder and act more considerate and act like they care about others, but they don't really. They're just doing it because they think they should, because intellectually that seems like the better thing to do. But that doesn't help you evolve. Acting doesn't push evolution. Intent does. Why are you doing that? Because you think it's a good thing to do? Well, that's nice and it's civilizing for the rest of us, but it's not going to help you, evolve yourself. You have to do it. You have to be kind, be cooperative, be caring, not act it. And the only way you can do that is if you grow up on your own path in your own way through your own experience. Otherwise, you're acting out of something that you think it should be, which is where most of the people in religion are. They're there because their family tradition is there, and they're acting out the process. They're not really growing up much, which is why being spiritual and being religious are two very different things. You can be very religious and not very spiritual. You can be very religious and be full of belief and full of arrogance and full of hate and still be very religious. But that belief and arrogance and hate are all very contradictory to being spiritual. So those are not the same things. They're very different.